My dad's name is Rafael. My brother and I learned, as children, that there are many Rafaels. Not just in general, but in my family. My father has cousins, uncles, both of his grandfathers, all sorts of relatives named Rafael. Growing up, my brother and I would joke that we were going to name our kids Rafael and watch our dad in quiet agony over the idea. Then we read 100 Years of Solitude. We stopped making those jokes. The seminal work of magical realism, 100 Years of Solitude, focuses on a family, La Familia Buendia, over the course of 100 years, playing off of the repeated use of names to deliver the experience of systems of social expectation on individuals. Magical realism as a genre is uniquely good at demonstrating what systems of power look like on an interpersonal level, because the blend between magical and real delivers the emotional experience of what it's like under these systems. The fantastical is necessary because those in positions of power might find the effect of these systems, what it is like living under them, too unbelievable. As Kenyan professor Yvonne García says,
We tell the truth and people say we make it up.
The magical realism of Pan's Labyrinth and Sorry to Bother You realizes this. With the use of intersectionality, we'll analyze these films and talk about the humanizing of systems and how it illuminates the way these systems of power are perpetuated into cycles. Magical realism is a storytelling style utilizing fantasy elements to emphasize the experiential emotion of reality. Unlike Gothic, fantasy, parable, or fairy tale, the fantastic or magical is not taken as something separate from reality. Instead, magic is lowered and reality is elevated to be on the same level. The fantastical isn't confined to a dream space. The worlds of magic and reality intersect and intertwine. As such, magical realism thrives in liminal spaces, places between. It is in these places where the line between fantasy and reality can be blurred. In the opening scene of 100 Years of Solitude, it is the young town of Macondo and the traveling circus that visits. In this heightened space, we are introduced to fantastic items like magic carpets and potions to forget bad memories, as well as real things such as glass that lets you see distant things big and metal bars that bring other metal to them. Among the fantasy, what stuck out to the protagonists, La Familia Buendia, was ice. Coming from a jungle town in Colombia before electricity, this was as magical as the magic. Like a diamond, but big as a chest, and so cold to the touch it burned. The magic and mundane lived alongside each other, so the fantastic can become real, and the real fantastic. Like this framing of ice, there's sometimes an uncanny feeling from very real images. I get it whenever I look at WW1 Cavalry, especially when the horses have gas masks. Don't get me started on the dogs. Hayao Miyazaki's The Wind Rises uses its setting of pre-war Japan to emphasize this, with imagery such as cows pulling the latest in airplane technology, or traditional swimsuits on war-ready battleships. These very real images can be magical realist because they demonstrate how reality can feel dreamlike. The blurring goes both ways, from the unreal into the real, as well as from the real into the unreal. Let's look at this treatment of liminality in writer-director Guillermo del Toro's 2006 movie, Pan's Labyrinth. The story follows Ofelia as she is brought to a military base in Civil War-era Spain by her mother, who has recently married the commanding officer there, who is a fascist.
Porque esta gente parte de una idea equivocada, que somos todos iguales.
The base is next to a labyrinth in which Ofelia meets a faun who tells her she is a princess and gives her 3 tasks so she can return to her kingdom in the underworld. The military base, meanwhile, is on the heels of anti-fascist rebels, and the tasks Ofelia must complete mirror the espionage actions of Mercedes, a house servant serving as a double agent for the rebels who becomes a mother figure to Ofelia. Pan's Labyrinth uses a setting of liminality through the time between civil war and a fully established Franco government, on the edge of important world events. There's also a physical liminality. The film's rural setting of dark undergrowth and woodland helps enable a blurring between reality and fantasy. This liminality is used to build acceptance of perception being emphasized over literal reality, accentuating the lived nature of magical realism. This isn't just true of images. The dinner speech by the Capitan could feel ham-handed and untrue if the rest of the world didn't feel heightened. In a Time interview, Boots Riley said of Sorry to Bother You, "When I set out to write the movie, there was nothing in my head that was fantastical. But as I took the journey with Cassius, I realized that some of the things I wanted to talk about The bigger ideas could start feeling heavy-handed, or the dialogue could feel corny. In trying to avoid cliché, I realized if I bent the reality of the world that was there, it actually drew attention to that parallel point in our actual reality. The elevation of reality into the space of magic makes the symbolic more acceptable. The equation of the fantastic to the real means things can be taken as both.
Maybe it's saying that capitalism dehumanizes them?
Maybe the artist is being literal. Maybe worry-free is turning workers into horses.
The fantastic can only be perceived by Ophelia. It is used to distance herself from the reality around her. Yet, in that distance, there emerges parallels. Her reality is being translated into the fantastic. That translation between reality and fantastic doesn't go one way, though. Her mother is perhaps cured by the root baby and milk. She seems to escape her room with the magic chalk, and she might pass through the magical openings in the labyrinth. These do not have to be taken as literal or imagination exclusively. They can live in an ambiguous space. The experience of living through it is the important part. Even if she's living in a fantasy world, whether real or not, the fantasy world led her down the path to destroy this guy. She's using her imagination to find solace in a horrible situation. It's her coping mechanism. Hell, it's our coping mechanism. Magical realism as a coping mechanism emphasizes how the inclusion of fantastical elements and the unique challenge they pose to reality relate to lived experience. Magical realism is like a memory, a reconstruction with imperfect knowledge. Thinking of magical realism as a coping mechanism can give insight into how the genre shows us what systems look like on an interpersonal level. At its best, magical realism shows us multiple systems at play at once, with social meaning layered. Because magical realism looks at the lived experience of people, it's great at looking at intersectionality theory. Intersectionality, a term coined in its academic usage by Kimberly Crenshaw, emphasizes the ways different aspects of our identity, under the influence of different systems, are impactful to varying degrees in different people's lives, depending on the context and history of those facets of identity. Intersectionality sees identity as greater than the sum of racism and sexism. The oppression and privileges of facets of identity cannot be considered modularly. They do not simply stack. Instead, the ways power structures interact with each person's blend of identities is unique and contextual. An important aspect of intersectionality theory is the emphasis on lived experience. Crenshaw's own research leading to the creation of intersectionality theory focused on how Black women can experience discrimination in ways that are both similar to and different from those experienced by white women and Black men. Boots Riley explores this in his debut film Sorry to Bother You, which follows Cassius Green at his new job at a call center, leading him to learn about his white voice and rising through the ranks, becoming a total scab in the process. In following Cash through the call center, we see how not all Black people are treated the same. A poor Black person is treated differently than a rich Black person. This isn't to say that being rich entirely negates the racial oppression of being Black, just that the privileges of being rich makes the racism towards Black people manifest in different ways.
You are in your sexual prime, the top of the reproductive pile.
It is this individual experience that's important to magical realism because magical realism is particularly well suited to showing how these large systems look on an interpersonal level. These are stories of oppression, colonialism, fascism, and systems too large to understand the human scope of. What is real looks magical to an outsider, so to properly convey the feeling, fantastic elements are ingrained in the world.
It goes beyond what we can accept as real. It's like magical. So we're not going to believe it. And then it ends up, right, that the truth is worse than any fiction could write.
Escúcheme bien. Si tiene que escoger, salve al niño. Ese niño llevará mi nombre. Y el nombre de mi padre. Sálvelo a él.
What I come back to is this notion that they want the reader, the non-initiated reader, the reader who is still caught up in the binary between the real and the not real, that they want to challenge that positioning.
Stories of systems aren't the only kind of story magical realism can tell, but they are a kind I think it is uniquely situated to tell. Looking at other magical realist works, such as Amelie and Birdman, the central focus of the magical realism isn't systems playing out on an interpersonal level. Instead, these films focus on intense emotional states as the vector through which to blur the real and non-real. This isn't to say that these films don't deal with the systematic, just that their themes are informed by systems rather than directly about them. The binary vision of reality is challenged in Pan's Labyrinth when Ophelia uses the root baby to save her mother, or perhaps she would have been fine regardless.
No me lo explico, pero me alegro.
Intense emotional states, similar to those in Amelie and Birdman, build a middle ground between real and non-real, a quantum space where things can be both real and fantastical, or perhaps neither. Guillermo del Toro himself said, "I am not in control of what you choose to believe in. I am not in control of what you think is more important. I'm telling you the story." The breaking of this binary creates wider spaces for subjective interpretation in stories. Let's look at how Sorry to Bother You challenges the binary between real and non-real in Cash's first calls, and what that blend tells us thematically. As a generally film-literate public, we see the wide in a different location and understand this as a different location. This expectation is subverted when we see Cash drop in and exist in the space. We move back to a wide similar to the first one, letting us see the intrusion, as well as both of the residents looking directly at Cash. There is an acknowledgement of reality. The discomfort on Cash's face then serves a dual purpose, allowing him to be an audience surrogate in the fantastic as well as feeling uncomfortable at the unexpected invasiveness of it. The lack of close-ups also enhances the callousness and impersonality, even with the invasiveness. The subversion of expected film language, combined with the distant composition, balances invasiveness and impersonality. The cut back to Cash at the call center, his desk unmoved, makes us understand this as symbolic as well. The third call starts with our first insert of the call script. Here we have over the shoulders, putting them in the same space. They are far apart though, and the shoulders we are over cuts out the face completely. Not only is the face obscured by the back of the head, where their eyes would be is completely cut out of frame.
I'm sorry, young man. We don't have any money. My husband's in the hospital. He's 73. He's got stage 4 cancer.
When she starts crying, we finally get a close-up on Cash. We're back in his head, which lets us understand there is humanity in the disgusting acts of the capitalist extraction system. But since we are in his head, we don't get to see the woman up close. We don't get to be with her in that moment. When we cut back to Cash, we get the same angle as the first close-up, but back at the call center. The intercutting between the call center and the caller challenges the physical barrier, in the process establishing a more complex emotional barrier. Cash almost empathizes with the old woman, but the capitalist incentives undercut that. She's pulled out of the intimacy of the call, back to the call center. We see how the capitalist system is influencing and enacted by the individual. By existing in both locations simultaneously, we are shown the humanity of the workers and the emotional toll it takes on both sides of the phone. The only advice on how to keep moving is an impersonal message with the boss's best interest in mind. Stick to the script. Holman, Chiswick, and Totterdale at the University of Sheffield described the toll on call center workers as emotional dissonance. Emotional dissonance occurs when there is a discrepancy between what a person is required to express by the organization and what they feel. Tactics like monitoring workers' calls and performance comparisons worsen this and lead to emotional exhaustion, anxiety, and depression. Cash could be worse at his job and perhaps be helpful to this woman. Instead, it is his job to suck as much money out of people as possible. What he's selling isn't really important. It could be anything, and it is anything. Whatever it takes. In between all these, we get the increasing brokenness of the copy machine in the back, giving us an incessant feeling of something spiraling out of control in an attempt to make more and more exponentially. It's capitalism. There is a clear injustice being perpetrated against the workers.
Does that mean we get paid more?
No. Okay, but what is capital, right?
Those with higher access to resources do not face the dangers and detriments as those who suffer from what Paul Farmer calls structural violence. Structural violence refers to forms of suffering not caused by interpersonal physical violence, instead referring to access to resources, limiting of agency and decision-making, and other forms of discrimination that can restrain access to basic needs.
Damn, God made this land for all of us. And greedy people like you want to hog it to yourself and your family and charge all the rest of us for the right to live.
The concept of structural violence explains the oppressive environments clear to those living under it, but often hidden to those in privilege due to its non-overt nature. It is this non-overt nature that makes magical realism so well-suited to illuminating structural violence. Pan's Labyrinth looks at the agency taken from women and children, and the intersection therein, under a fascist regime. The film deals with control over bodies. Arriving at the military camp, Vidal insists that Ofelia's mother uses a wheelchair against her wishes. His expectations of femininity and submission reveal themselves from the very beginning when he greets them with a male ending, bienvenidos, the male form of the word.
Bienvenidos.
In reference to the unborn son, as words defer male when there's even just one boy present. His demand for control, the societal expectation for that, down to the linguistic level, #bienvenidex, manifests more subtly with Ofelia and the handshake, as well as the demand from her mother that she calls Vidal father. We see the age dimension of power when Ofelia's mom gives her a dress and shoes. Her mother admits she would have loved to have these as a child. Ofelia has already been scolded for exploring and getting dirty, and she had expressed hope that the surprise would be a book. Instead, Ofelia's mother is leveraging her power over Ofelia to project onto Ofelia what she wishes she had and what she wants Ofelia to be. No one is forcing her into the dress, but control is still being implemented through societal and structural expectations. Furthermore, it is not just control over her body as a woman, but as a young girl. This can help explain why magical realism so often deals with the cyclical nature of the systems it portrays. 100 Years of Solitude uses the very names of the characters to make you as a reader want the expectation of sameness just to keep everyone straight in your head. These are both stories that place you on the individual level when talking about very large, long-term processes. When Vidal discovers the root baby in Pan's Labyrinth, his lack in belief is founded on power dynamics of age, gender, and concepts of civilized by pointing out how gross the thing from outside is. As the root burns, Ofelia's mother gets worse. This is followed by Vidal killing the doctor for disobeying the unquestioning fascist hierarchy, whereupon he learns his wife needs a doctor, quite possibly from the root baby dying. And the troop medic isn't enough, so Ofelia's mother dies. The patriarchy and fascism intertwine to bad outcomes. For everyone, really. Structural violence into physical violence, into tragedy on all fronts. Ofelia's mother went to Vidal because her options for security were gone.
Padre de Ofelia, que confeccionaba los uniformes. Ah, vaya. Y cuando él murió, yo entré a trabajar en una tienda de géneros. Y hace poco más de un año, el capitán y yo nos volvimos a encontrar.
Now, Ofelia's options for security are just about gone, and we see how, if she didn't have the Fawn and the rebels to go to, they are the same and different after all, she would be stuck in this place. We are given a demonstration of how cycles perpetuate on an individual level. To see this in Sorry to Bother You, let's contrast the previous calls with a later successful call. We pan over the call center from a higher, less constraining angle. More is in focus, and we see Cash leaning back in a clearly comfortable position. His conversation cuts to the location of the client seamlessly, further disrupting the idea of dichotomous spaces. He's also referencing the space of the apartment, gesturing to where the books he's selling might sit. The client is smoking a joint and offers it to Cash, who takes it. He's interacting on a personal level.
It's fuck time. You know what I mean? Yeah, holla, 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 holla.
Taking what previously made him uncomfortable and turning it into familiarity. That he is acting comfortably with casual sex from a man, but was so taken aback by a woman's overt sexuality is another conversation, and we will get there. For now, I want to stick with the idea of cycles and point to a subtle way Sorry to Bother You demonstrates selling out from a more distant frame. Early in the movie, our first introduction to the Left Eye is Cynthia Rose. The Left Eye is an activist group in opposition to worry-free and, generally, capitalist exploitation. Cynthia Rose is also the have a cola and smile bitch girl. When Cash is being a scab, he is hit in the head with a cola can. The video goes viral, and suddenly the former protester is advertising the unifying powers of Cola brand cola.
Wait, no, I got the right one here. There it is.
We have a parallel to Cash's story of selling out,
For an amount of money that could buy 4 white babies.
making him the victim this time. By having this background narrative parallel the foreground individual story, the filmmakers can emphasize the individual experience while making broader stories and statements about societal trends. Though there's a focus on cycles, magical realism often follows with an optimism of how to break from them. Boots Riley, describing why he made the film Magical Realist, says, What I tried to convey is that through all the craziness, there's an optimism that comes when you realize there's a way to fight back. For Guillermo del Toro, Pan's Labyrinth is a movie that ends on a note of absolute hope and beauty, with a tiny white flower blooming on a dead tree, and an insect watching it as it blooms. For me, that's as heavy as the entire outcome of a war. The hope for these movies is twofold. By focusing on the absurdity suffered at an individual level, it both demonstrates the cyclical nature, as well as showcasing how people are pushed to radically break from it. Both stories feature rebels giving a place for people who want to break to go, and giving the audience a possible look into how to act in their own lives.
If you get shown a problem, but have no idea how to control it, then you just decide to get used to the problem.
Through the heightened reality magical realism shows us, these movies inform us of systems of oppression, show us how they are destructive to everyone but those who run them, and sometimes even them, and give a path to break from those systems. Like how 100 Years of Solitude showed my brother and I the pressures and expectations put on an inherited name, and how it guaranteed that we, no matter how much we love and want to honor our father, would never name a kid Rafael.